She had no scent. In a world where your mate's smell hits you like a blade between the ribs, warm copper, pine smoke, rain-soaked earth, Lyra Ashthorne carried nothing. No signal, no pull, no promise. The other kids called her hollow. The alphas called her broken. The elders called her an omen. She called herself alive, and that was enough to make them all uncomfortable. If you've ever been told you were too much of nothing to matter, stay right here, because this story is for you. Drop your city in the comments, hit that like, and let's find out what happens when the most powerful kings in the world can't figure out why they can't stop thinking about a girl who smells like absolutely no one. The morning of the gathering began the way most mornings in Ashford Ridge began, with Lyra Ashthorne already invisible. She moved through the market district before the stalls fully opened, when the cobblestones still held the cold of the night and the fog sat low over the river 2 streets down. She kept her shoulders in, her hood up, her eyes on the ground ahead of her. Not because she was afraid, she had trained herself past afraid years ago. She moved small because small meant unnoticed, and unnoticed meant she could keep her job, keep her room, keep the thin arrangement she had built between herself and the rest of the world. "You're late." Gareth didn't look up from the crates he was stacking when she came through the supply entrance of the Iron Paw Inn. He was a wide man, weathered and blunt, and his opinion of most things could be summed up in 3 words or fewer. "I'm early," she said. "Gathering day. I needed you an hour ago." He straightened and finally looked at her, and whatever he read in her face made him grunt and go back to the crates. "Get the linen sorted. The east wing's filling up by midday. King's delegations take the upper floors. You stay out of their way." "When do I not?" "Every time something goes wrong. Go." She went. The Iron Paw was the largest inn in Ashford Ridge, which sat at the geographic and political center of the 6 kingdoms. A neutral city by ancient treaty, administered by a council of elders who answered to no single king and therefore to all of them simultaneously. Once every 100 years, the gathering brought every king, alpha, and council lord to the city. The logistics alone were enough to break a lesser establishment. Gareth had been preparing for 2 months. His staff had been reduced by 4 in that same period, 3 of whom left when they found out who was coming, and 1 of whom Gareth had thrown out personally. Lyra had stayed. She always stayed. She pulled the linen cart through the service corridor, tracking the work in her head. East wing, 12 rooms, double sets, plus the ceremonial suite at the end of the hall that she was explicitly not supposed to enter. She had extra pillows stacked on the lower shelf of the cart. She had the small folded cards with the Iron Paw seal in her apron pocket for the room numbers. She had the route memorized. What she did not have, and had never had, and had long since stopped grieving, was a scent. Not in the way every wolf was supposed to. Not the warm, biological signature that other wolves wore like a second skin, the one that told pack members who you were and told potential mates that you were theirs. Lyra had been born without it. No alpha had ever turned his head when she entered a room. No wolf had ever gone still and looked at her with that particular look, the one she had seen pass between mated pairs her entire life, the recognition that moved through them like a current. She had watched it happen to the girl who used to live in the room next to hers, watched the moment her packmate locked eyes with the merchant's son at a festival and went quiet in a way that said everything. She had watched it happen to people she liked, people she didn't, people who deserved it, and people who had no business receiving it. It had never happened to her. What had happened to her instead was this: an elder sniffing the air near her when she was 6 years old and frowning in a way that told her something was wrong before she understood what wrong meant. A packmaster's wife pulling her son away from the game they were playing at 8, saying something low and sharp that Lyra wasn't supposed to hear about how the Ashthorne girl was unnatural. A schooling master at 12 assigning her a seat at the back of the room, near the door, so her absence of scent wouldn't disrupt the other children's ability to concentrate. A rejection at 17 from a young alpha who had never shown any interest in her regardless, but who still felt the need to say it aloud in front of everyone. Not rejecting a bond because there was no bond to reject, just rejecting her existence in the space near his. "You carry nothing. Get out of my sight." She had carried nothing every day since, and she had survived every day since. These 2 facts were connected in ways she was still working out. Room 1, East Wing. She stripped the bed with efficiency, and remade it with the speed of someone who had done this particular task 400 times, which she had. She moved the cart to room 2. Outside the window at the end of the corridor, Ashford Ridge was coming awake in ways it normally didn't. She could hear it even through the stone walls. The particular noise of a city that was hosting power it wasn't sure what to do with. More boots on the cobblestones, more horses, more voices in registers that carried. She did not go to the window, she made the bed. By the time she reached room 6, the East Wing had its first arrivals. 2 scouts from the Duskmere delegation, from the smell of them, pine and cold water, and something metallic underneath. They passed her in the corridor without looking at her, which was not unusual. She pressed the cart against the wall to let them by, and they walked past like she was furniture, which she had learned to accept was a reasonable way to get through a day. It was the one after them who stopped. She didn't register him immediately. She was reaching to adjust a pillowcase that had come loose at the corner, and her back was partly turned, and the hallway had grown briefly loud with the sound of a shutter banging somewhere below. Then the noise settled, and she became aware that the footsteps behind her had stopped. She turned. He was younger than she expected from the quality of the clothes, mid-20s maybe, with close-cropped dark hair and eyes the particular gray of flint just before it strikes. He wasn't in ceremonial dress yet. Travel clothes, good leather, a sword worn on the left side. He was looking at her with an expression she couldn't categorize. Wolves looked at her in several predictable ways. Dismissal was most common. Discomfort was second. Occasional pity, which she hated more than the others. What this one was doing with his face didn't match any of the categories. "You," he said. "Room 7 is ready," she said. "If that's your room, the turn sheet's been changed." He didn't respond to that. He was still looking at her, and something about the quality of his attention made the hairs on her forearms lift under her sleeves. Not fear. She knew what fear felt like. This was something different, and she didn't have a name for it. "What's your name?" he said. It wasn't quite a question. "Staff." His jaw moved. "That's not a name." "It's the one I'm using in this hallway. Can I get past you?" A beat. Then he stepped aside, but she felt his gaze follow her the entire length of the corridor until she pushed through the service door at the far end, and even then she stood for a moment in the stairwell with her hand flat against the wall and her heart doing something irregular that she told it to stop. She went back to work. The gathering's formal opening wasn't until that evening at the council's great hall 3 blocks east of the inn. Lyra had no intention of attending. She never had any intention of attending anything. Her plan for the evening was to finish the East Wing, start on the laundry from the morning, eat whatever Gareth's cook left in the kitchen, and go to her room before the crowds got thick enough to make the streets uncomfortable. She made it through the East Wing. She made it through the laundry. She was halfway through the kitchen meal, bread and cold mutton and something pickled that she ate without identifying, when Mare came in from the direction of the main entrance with her eyes wide and her cap askew. Marette was 20, 2 years younger than Lyra, and she burned through excitement the way kindling burned through fire. "You need to see the square," she said. "I don't need to see anything." 6 kings, Lyra, all 6 of them arriving within the same hour. It's not supposed to happen like that. It's never happened like that. They always stagger it for the politics, but something's wrong with the schedule or something happened on the roads and they're all coming in at once. She grabbed the door frame like it was the only thing keeping her in the building. "The elder Corvan nearly fainted on the steps. Come and look." "I'm eating." "You're always eating. Come and look." She didn't want to. She went. The gathering square was the oldest part of Ashford Ridge, paved in a dark stone that absorbed heat during the day and released it slowly through the night, so that even in the cool of an early autumn evening, it radiated something almost warm up through the soles of your boots. It was large enough to hold 1,000 wolves when it was crowded, and right now it held perhaps 200, but the 200 it held were arranged in the kind of rigid, charged pattern that told Lyra immediately that whatever was happening here had weight to it. 6 delegations, 6 banners, 6 circles of guards and courtiers, and alphas in formal dress arranged around a shared center that was currently occupied by the Elder Council in their gray ceremonial coats, looking collectively as though they had been asked to mediate between 6 different fires. And the kings. Lyra had never seen a king before. She had seen alphas, had grown up around them, had worked alongside them, had been dismissed and looked through and occasionally leered at by them for the better part of her adult life. She understood alpha presence the way you understand weather. You didn't need to enjoy it to respect what it could do. Kings were something else. She registered it even from the back of the square, even with 30 people between her and them, even knowing she had no instinctive biological response to power, and never had. They were different in the way that old stone is different from new stone, the way a river with real depth is different from a shallow one. They occupied space differently. The crowd gave them room without seeming to decide to. She made herself look at them because she was here and she might as well look. The tallest was from the northern reach, she thought, based on the furs and the silver and black of his banner. Dark-haired, massive across the shoulders, jaw like something carved for a monument. He was in conversation with the elder Corvin and he looked deeply displeased about it. The one with the red banner was Calder of the Ironwood. She knew the house colors. He was older than she'd pictured from the stories, lean and gray at the temples, with the careful stillness of a man who had made difficult decisions for a long time and was comfortable with the weight of them. She was cataloging them, detached, the way she cataloged most things, when the one with the gray and gold banner turned. It was the man from the hallway. She processed this information with the part of her brain that handled surprises calmly, which had been very well exercised over the years. He was a king. Obviously he was a king. He was staying in the East Wing's upper floor, and she had assumed he was a lord or a senior alpha from one of the delegations, and she had talked to him like he was a person, which he was, but still. He hadn't found her yet in the crowd. She used the moment to look at the other three. A woman, tall and dark-skinned, silver in her braided hair, which meant she was the ruling monarch of the South Reach, the only female king in recorded history. A younger man, almost too young, with the red clay and gold of the western foothills on his banner, and one who stood slightly apart from the others, in plain dark clothes without much ceremony, which was itself a statement. She was about to turn and go back to the inn when something shifted. She couldn't name it exactly. The crowd noise didn't change, the light didn't change. But something in the arrangement of the square altered by some small, precise degree, and the shift came from the king in gray and gold, who had turned his head in her direction. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the crowd, scanning it. The way you scan a room when your ears have caught something your eyes haven't located yet. Then the Northern King looked up. Then Calder of Ironwood stopped mid-sentence. Then the woman from the South Reach lifted her chin. They were all doing the same thing, scanning, searching. With that particular quality of attention that wolves had when their instincts grabbed them before their minds could, when some signal had fired and the body was already responding while the rational part was still asking what. Lyra went very still. She knew what wolves looked like when they caught a scent. She had watched it happen all her life. She had watched mates find each other across crowded rooms with exactly this quality of animal attention, this sharpening, this targeting. She was looking at 6 kings doing it simultaneously. In a square full of 200 wolves, every single one of whom had a scent, something had reached all 6 of the most powerful men and women in the known world at the same time and turned every one of them into a hunting posture. She was the only person in the square who had no scent. She didn't wait to see what happened next. She turned, pulled her hood up, and moved through the back edge of the crowd toward the inn's service alley. She kept her shoulders down and her pace even. She did not run. Running was the worst thing you could do when predators were scanning. She walked like she had somewhere legitimate to be, which she did, which was away. She made it to the alley. She made it through the service door. She made it up the back stairwell and to the corridor outside her room, and then she leaned against the wall and stood there in the dark, and let her heartbeat do what it wanted for a moment without trying to correct it. They weren't reacting to her. That was the rational explanation. They couldn't be. She had nothing for them to react to. Whatever was happening in that square was politics, tension, the accumulated pressure of 6 kingdoms in the same location for the first time in a century. She was a laundry worker. She had no scent. She was not relevant to anything that happened in that square. She told herself this with great conviction. Then she went to bed. She was up at dawn for the secondary morning shift, which was her rotation on gathering weeks, and she was carrying fresh towels to the Upper East Wing when she turned the corner of the main corridor and found that it was not empty the way it should have been at this hour. 3 men, all of them in the livery she didn't recognize, which meant a delegation she hadn't mapped yet. They were standing outside the door of the ceremonial suite, and one of them was talking in a low, clipped voice to someone inside the partially open door. And from the body language of all 3, she registered quickly that whatever was being discussed was not casual. She kept her head down and angled toward the wall, wheels of the towel cart quiet on the runner rug. "Doesn't make sense. I've circled the whole wing twice." The voice was coming from inside the suite. "Radek says it came from the square." The man nearest the door talking into the gap. "Corvin's people are saying they don't know who it was. Corvin's people are useless. This isn't..." A pause. "It's not a scent. It's the absence of one. Do you understand what I'm telling you? I can locate every wolf in this building right now. I know where the Ironwood delegation is sleeping. I know which room the Southreach Queen is in. I know the Fox Alphas are in the Western Courtyard having breakfast because I can smell the food, and I can smell them. And in the middle of all of that, there is something I cannot locate, something that should have a signature and doesn't, and it's the loudest thing in the building." The men outside the door exchanged a look. One of them saw her. She was already past them. She kept moving. She did not look back. She got to the service closet at the end of the corridor and stood inside it among the spare linens and the bucket smell and the cold air coming through the high, narrow window, and she pressed the back of her hand to her mouth and made herself breathe. The loudest thing in the building. She was the thing he was describing. She knew it the way you know something that you have always known and have been refusing to look at directly. She was the hole in the scent map. She was the blank space. She had assumed her entire life that absence meant invisibility, that nothing to smell meant nothing to find. She had assumed wrong. By mid-morning, the dynamic in the inn had shifted in a way she could feel in the walls. Gareth pulled her aside in the kitchen corridor with his broad hand wrapped around her elbow, not unkindly, and said, "Something is going on upstairs. You stay on the ground floor today. I have the east wing too. Marit will cover it. Stay down." He looked at her with the particular expression he used when he didn't want to say the full thing. "They're asking questions, the delegations, about staff, about who was in the square last night." Her stomach went flat and cold. "What kind of questions?" "The kind that aren't their business, which I told them. You weren't in the square last night." It was a statement, but it had a question in it. "I walked past," she said. "For 5 minutes. I came back." Gareth absorbed this with the expression of a man adding numbers he didn't like. "Stay on the ground floor," he said again, and let her go. She stayed on the ground floor. She restocked the front desk supply cabinet. She carried a delivery of oil lanterns from the receiving dock to the cellar storage. She peeled vegetables in the kitchen for an hour because the cook was overwhelmed, and the task required no explanation and no conversation. She was good at finding tasks that required no conversation. The gathering's first formal session began at noon in the council hall. She knew this because she could hear the city's bells through the kitchen window, 3 long tones that meant the formal proceeding had started. She also knew it because the noise level at the inn dropped abruptly as the delegations all moved toward the hall, and for about 20 minutes the ground floor was almost quiet. She used the quiet to carry laundry to the back courtyard, where the inn's lines were strung between the posts. She was halfway through hanging the second set of sheets when she heard the gate at the far end of the courtyard open. She didn't turn immediately. She finished the pin she was placing. Then she turned. The man from the hallway. The king in gray and gold, whose name she still hadn't bothered to find out, because finding it out would mean he was real, and not a problem that would resolve itself if she ignored it. He was alone, which was unusual for a king. He was looking at her, which was not unusual for him, apparently. She pulled another sheet from the basket. "The session started," she said. "The bells." "I know." "You're missing it." "I know that too." He walked into the courtyard, hands loose at his sides. He had changed out of yesterday's travel clothes into something cleaner but still plainly cut, and she noticed that whatever she had read in his face in the hallway was present again now. That unclassifiable expression, sharper now, more deliberate. "You were in the square last night," he said. "A lot of people were in the square last night. Not like you." She put the sheet on the line and reached for the next one. "I'm laundry staff. I don't know what you think you noticed." I think I noticed the absence of everything I usually notice. In a square full of wolves. He stopped when he was 6 feet from her, and she made herself keep working because stopping would be conceding something. I have been tracking scent since I was 4 years old. My instincts have never failed me, not once, not in 26 years and 3 wars and 4 treaty negotiations where I had to read rooms full of people who wanted me dead. A pause. Last night, in the middle of 300 wolves, there was a blank space, a gap. I don't have a word for what I was sensing, which is that I couldn't sense anything, but the nothing was loud. That's a strange thing to say. It's a strange thing to experience. He took one more step. She told her hands to keep working, and they obeyed her. I want to know your name. I want to finish this laundry. That isn't an answer. Neither is whatever you're doing in this courtyard instead of your session. She looked at him then, because she had decided that looking away was also conceding something, and she had never developed the habit of giving things away for free. You're one of the 6, whatever you are, whichever banner. You have a summit to attend, and I have sheets to hang. We both have places to be. Something moved across his face. Not offense. He didn't look offended. He looked like a man solving an equation that had just added a new variable he hadn't expected to find interesting. Stellan, he said. She waited. Stellan Vark, 3rd King of the Grey March. He said it flatly, the way someone states a thing they're used to having received with ceremony, and he watched her face for the ceremony, and she didn't give it to him. You know what the Grey March is. I know what all 6 kingdoms are. I clean their rooms. A pause stretched between them. Somewhere above the courtyard wall, a bird landed on the ridge of the roof and then lifted again. What happened to your scent? Stellan Vark said. It was the most direct anyone had ever asked her that. Most wolves danced around it, or pretended they couldn't tell, or made faces that said it without the words. She had received every variation. She had never received the straight question. I was born without one, she said. I'm sure your instincts are fine. I'm just the exception. There is no exception in mate biology. There has never been one. Here I am, anyway. He was quiet for a moment. He had a quality of stillness that she associated with people who had learned to wait, not passive waiting, but the active kind, where the stillness is a strategy. She had a similar quality herself, for similar reasons. How long have you been in Ashford Ridge? He said. Long enough. Where are you from? Somewhere else. You're not going to give me anything, are you? You're a king who wandered into a service courtyard to ask questions of laundry staff, she said. I think we're both doing something unexpected today. He looked at her for a long moment, and she held the look, and then something shifted in the quality of his expression. The equation resolved or changed form, or complicated itself further. She couldn't tell. He nodded once, slowly, like he had decided something. Stay in this inn, he said. Don't go out tonight. You don't give orders to laundry staff. I'm not ordering. I'm advising. Something in his voice changed on that, dropped into something that was less the king register and more a different register she didn't have a category for. The others noticed too, not just me, all 5 of them. Last night, after the square, there were conversations I was not invited to, and 2 of them I was, and they all had the same subject. She went still. They're going to look for the blank space, he said. Some of them want it for a weapon. One of them thinks it's a curse. The elder Corvan is trying to keep the lid on it, but Corvan is 1 man and there are 6 of us, and we haven't been in the same city in 100 years. Things happen at gatherings. Things happen, she said quietly. Stay inside. He held her gaze for 1 more beat. Then he turned and walked back toward the gate. Why are you telling me? She called after him. He stopped, hand on the gate latch, but didn't turn back. Because you're the only thing I've encountered in 26 years that I don't know how to read. And I don't kill things I don't understand. He pulled the gate open. Not anymore. He was gone. She stood in the courtyard with the half-hung sheets and the basket at her feet and the clear autumn sky overhead, and she understood for the first time with genuine clarity that she had been wrong about something fundamental. She had spent her whole life believing that having no scent made her invisible, made her nothing, made her beneath the notice of the powerful. She had it backwards. She was the blank space in a world that could read everything. She was the one frequency that cut through all the noise. And every king who had been at that summit last night had already noticed, was already circling, was already asking questions that Gareth was deflecting and that Mara didn't know the answers to and that the Elder Corvan apparently could not suppress. She had one asset in this situation, and it was the same one she had always had. She knew how to move quietly. She knew how to make herself small. She knew how to survive in the space between people who were powerful and people who were powerless, in the gap where those without resources had always lived. The question was whether the gap was still there. She bent and picked up the laundry basket. She finished hanging the sheets. She went back inside through the service door, and she counted the windows between the courtyard and the street, and she counted the streets between the inn and the eastern gate, and she counted the hours until dark. She was calculating. She was already calculating, because Stellan Vark had told her to stay inside, and that was the first intelligent piece of advice she had received in years, and she had absolutely no intention of following it if she needed to run. She was in the kitchen before supper, cutting bread at the long table, when Maret burst through the door from the main hall with her face the color of chalk and her eyes blown wide. "They're in the front room," Maret said. "All 6 of them, together. Gareth's trying to— I don't know what Gareth's trying to do. They walked in 10 minutes ago and they asked for the staff registry by name, and Gareth said he doesn't keep one, and then the Northern King put his hand flat on the front desk and said," she set the bread knife down, "said there is a wolf in this building that none of us consent, and we are not leaving until we find her." The kitchen was very quiet. Lyra looked at the bread on the table. She looked at her hands. She looked at the back door, 6 feet to her left, that opened onto the rear alley. Then she looked at Maret, who was vibrating with something between terror and a kind of manic energy, and she said, "Which way did Gareth tell them to go?" "He didn't. He's stalling. Lyra!" "Go back out there," she said. "Tell Gareth the kitchen is being cleaned, and it'll be a few minutes before supper's ready. Keep it ordinary. Keep it routine." "What are you going to do?" She picked the bread knife back up and set it in the rack where it belonged, because you didn't leave knives loose in a kitchen. "I'm going to figure out whether they found me because I'm something to be afraid of," she said, "or something to be used." She crossed to the back door and pushed it open onto the alley, and the cold air hit her face, and behind her she heard the sound of the front room doors opening, multiple footsteps, multiple bodies, the quality of presence that 6 kings in motion made in a building that wasn't designed to hold them all at once. And she ran. She ran 3 blocks before she let herself slow down. The alley behind the iron paw dumped into a narrow service lane that ran parallel to the main market road, and she took it east, away from the council hall, away from the square, away from the concentrated weight of 6 delegations that had apparently decided she was worth walking out of a formal session for. The cobblestones were slick with morning damp that hadn't dried, and she kept her boots deliberate on the uneven surface because a twisted ankle right now was a death sentence in a way it normally wasn't. She turned south at the cooperage, ducked through the gap between the tannery wall and the dry goods warehouse, and came out into the small courtyard behind the chandler's shop where she had bought candles twice a month for the past 2 years. She pressed her back against the tannery stone and listened. No pursuit, no footsteps, no sound that was wrong. She stood there and let her breathing even out and thought about what she actually knew. She knew that 6 kings had walked into a public inn and demanded a staff registry, which was a political act with a very short life before it became a public incident. She knew Gareth would deflect for as long as he could without putting himself in front of a king's direct authority, which meant she had minutes, not hours. She knew Ashford Ridge was a neutral city, and theoretically no one could be arrested here without council sanction, and she knew theoretically meant nothing when the people doing the arresting were the same ones who wrote the treaties in the first place. What she didn't know was what they actually wanted. Stellan Vark had said weapon, had said curse, had given her a warning she hadn't asked for, which meant he was operating with some agenda she hadn't mapped yet, and unmapped agendas in powerful men were the most dangerous terrain she knew. She pushed off the wall and moved again, because staying still was the same as giving up. The city had a rhythm she knew well after 2 years, and she used it the way she used everything available to her. Not because she was exceptional at anything in particular, but because she had spent her whole life studying what the people around her were doing and finding the angle they weren't watching. The market crowd was thickening toward midday. She pulled her hood lower and moved with it, not against it, cutting northwest toward the old city quarter where the buildings ran older and closer, and the alleys were wide enough for two people and not much else. She was almost to the bridge over the Ridgewater when the man stepped into her path. Not one of the delegations. Local. Heavy jaw, working clothes, and eyes that had already decided something before she came around the corner. He was looking at her with a flat, specific attention that told her he had been waiting in exactly this spot. "Lyra Ashthorne," he said. Her name in a stranger's mouth was a cold thing. "You have the wrong person." "I don't." He didn't move to grab her. He stood with his hands loose and his shoulders relaxed, which was a studied posture, the kind you practiced. "Someone wants to talk to you. I'm here to extend the invitation. Tell someone to find a different guest." "Not how this works." He finally moved, one step to the right, which wasn't toward her but which was deliberate. A redirect, a suggestion of direction, the kind of movement that was technically not force but was definitely coercion. "You can walk on your own, or I can make walking on your own more complicated. Either way, we end up in the same place." She looked at him. She looked at the alley behind him, which was clear. She looked at the bridge ahead, which was not. Two more men on the bridge. Same posture, same studied calm. 3 against 1, in a city that didn't know her name 20 minutes ago. She went with the man. Not because she had no options, because walking into the room she was being walked to was more information than running away, and information had always been the only currency she actually trusted. He took her south and east, back toward the old city, but deeper in, to a building that had been a magistrate's hall some decades back, and was now rented as overflow accommodation for delegations too large or too private to use the main inns. The inside smelled of old wood, new fire, and the particular combination of leather and authority that she was learning to associate with people who held power the way other people held weapons. Always. And with awareness. The room she was brought to had 4 people in it already. She recognized the South Reach Queen first, Empress Asha Ven, the only female monarch at the gathering, who in person was taller than the stories and quieter in her movement than the political dispatches suggested. She sat at the room's single table with a cup of something she wasn't drinking, and her eyes found Lyra before the door finished opening. Beside her stood a man in ironwood colors. Not Calder himself, she didn't think, but senior in the delegation, with the kind of face that had watched a lot of things happen and learned to keep its opinion of them off the surface. The third was the young Western Foothills king, who Lyra had pegged from a distance last night as too young for what he was carrying. Up close, that impression didn't change. He had energy where the others had stillness. He was standing at the window and he turned when she came in. The fourth was Stellan Vark. He was leaning against the far wall with his arms folded, and his expression when he saw her was not surprise. He had known she was coming, which meant he had also known she was going to run, and had arranged for her to be collected, and had not warned her about the arrangement when he had been warning her about everything else in that courtyard. And she filed this information away in the part of her that kept track of things that felt like manipulation even when they were presented as concern. "Sit down," Empress Asha said. It wasn't a request. It also wasn't a shout. It was simply the way that people spoke when they had never in their life needed to raise their voice to be obeyed. Lyra sat, not because of the tone, because she had decided she wanted to see what was on the other side of this conversation. "You know what you are," Empress Asha said. "I know what I'm not," Lyra said. "A scent. Apparently that's sufficient to get kidnapped in a neutral city." "Nobody kidnapped you." The young Foothills king, impatient. He had a name she hadn't caught yet, and she was going to let him keep it until he did something that earned the information. "You were approached. 3 men on a bridge is an approach. You would have run." He shrugged, not apologizing for it. "You were already running." "Correct." That was the reasonable response. Stellan said nothing from his wall. He was watching her the way he had watched her in the courtyard. That quality of active stillness, reading something he hadn't finished reading yet. The Ironwood man spoke for the first time. His voice was dry and methodical, the voice of someone who had prepared what he was going to say. "There are 6 kings at this gathering. The 6 of us have, collectively, Been unable to locate a scent signature in this city that should be present and is not. The elders have no record of an anomaly of this type. The last documented case of a wolf born without a mate scent is... He stopped, consulted something in his memory. Uncertain. The records are incomplete. What records? Lyra said. A silence that was 3 different things in 3 different people. Ancient ones, Empress Asha said. How ancient? Old enough that their authenticity has been debated for 2 generations. She set down the cup she hadn't been drinking from. Old enough that 3 of the 6 kings at this gathering have people who spend their careers studying them, and none of those people have agreed on what they mean. What do they say? Lyra said. In the ancient records. Another pause. This one was deliberate. She could read it as a choice, not a hesitation. Empress Asha was deciding how much to offer. That was interesting. It meant she wanted something badly enough to negotiate, and people who wanted things badly enough to negotiate were people you could work with. They describe a bloodline, Asha said, that predates the mate bond system. A lineage that existed before the hierarchy of Alpha and Omega and King was codified, before the instinct structure was formalized. She chose the word carefully, like it didn't quite fit what she meant. The members of this bloodline were called the Unbound. The word landed in the room quietly. Unbound, Lyra said. They carried no mate scent, not because they were broken, because the mate bond had no authority over them. Asha's eyes were steady on her face. The bond was a system that someone built at some point in our history and built into our instincts so deeply that we stopped questioning whether it was always there. The Unbound existed before it. They remembered that it wasn't. Lyra sat with that. It was not a comfortable thing to sit with. It was the kind of information that resorted everything behind it, that made you look at the last 22 years of your life and find them rearranged. What happened to them? She said. The Unbound. The records stop, Asha said, abruptly, about 800 years ago. And your interpretation of that is what, exactly? Stellan spoke from the wall. That someone stopped the records on purpose. She looked at him. He looked back. There are 3 of us at this table, he said, who believe what the Empress is telling you. There are 3 more at this gathering who believe something different. He pushed off the wall and came to the table, standing at its corner, closer to her than the others. They believe the Unbound were a corruption, a flaw in the biology that was correctly identified and removed. They believe what you carry is evidence of that flaw persisting. He paused. And they believe removing it is a service. The word service in his mouth was precise and deliberate. How many people know I exist? She said. Her voice was level. She had learned at 12 years old how to keep her voice level during conversations that her body wanted to run from, and she had never unlearned it. By name? Stellan. 4 people in this room, and whoever hired the men who found you this morning. She turned her head. Those weren't your men. No, he said. They weren't. She absorbed that. The other 3, she said. The kings who aren't in this room. Vareth of the Northern Reach, the young Foothills king said, and this time she let herself care who he was because he was giving her something useful. He seemed to understand this. He kept going. He's been convinced since last night that you're a threat to pack hierarchy, an infection, his word, and he has the largest army at this gathering by a factor of 2. He let that land. Calder of Ironwood is undecided. He wants information before he decides you're dangerous, which makes him more dangerous than Vareth in some ways, because undecided people can be turned. And the third, Lyra said, a pause that was different from the others. Morden, Empress Asha said, King of the Deep West. The name meant something. She saw it in the room's collective posture, something tightening by degrees that hadn't been there before. What about him? Lyra said. Morden doesn't believe you're a flaw or a weapon, Stellan said. His voice had dropped into that register again, the one she didn't have a category for. Morden believes you're an asset that belongs to whoever gets there first. He's been collecting anomalies for a decade. Old artifacts, old bloodlines, old powers that don't fit the current system. A pause. He had a woman held for 3 years in his eastern fortress, because she could read the mate bond's direction without being part of it. She didn't survive the 3 years. The room was very quiet. So, Lyra said, one wants to kill me. One's undecided. One wants to put me in a cage. She looked at the three across from her, then at Stellan beside her. And you three? We want to understand what you are, Asha said. That's nicer language for the same cage. No. Asha's voice went flat and direct, the most direct she had been. It is not. Understanding something is not the same as owning it. I learned that distinction young, and I have built my entire kingdom on it, and you can check that claim against anyone in the South Reach if you find my word insufficient. Lyra looked at her for a long moment. Asha didn't look away. People who held real authority rarely did, and Lyra had learned to distinguish real authority from performed authority because one of them could help her, and the other one would bury her. What do you want from me? Lyra said. We want you alive and not in Morden's possession, Stellan said. Beyond that, we want what you want, which I suspect is information, and the space to use it on your own terms. You don't know what I want. No, he said, but I know you didn't run all the way out of the inn to stand still in an alley. You ran to think. That's a different thing. She said nothing. We can move you tonight, the Foothills King said. He was practically crackling with the urgency of it, leaning forward at the window. Get you out of Ashford Ridge before the gathering's second session. Vareth's people will look for you in the city first. By the time they expand the search, you'd be 2 days gone. To where? She said. My territory, Asha said. South Reach. It's the one place Vareth's network is thinnest. You'd have time to read the records, to understand what you carry. The offer was real. She could feel that. It was also not what it was presenting itself as, because nothing ever was. And she had been alive long enough to know that people who offered you protection were also offering you debt and control, and the subtle obligation of someone who had paid for your safety and expected to recoup the investment in some currency she hadn't been shown yet. She looked at her hands on the table. She looked at the door. I need to think, she said. You have until tonight, Stellan said. After tonight, the window closes. Vareth moves fast when he decides something, and he decided last night. She stood. I'll go back to the inn. That is not, the Foothills King started. I'll go back to the inn, she said again. I know every exit. I know the staff rotation. I know where the blind corners are and which rooms stay empty. It is the safest building in this city for me right now because I know it and you don't. And because Gareth will not give me up without a fight, and Gareth is worth 10 of your guards for the specific task of slowing down people who don't belong in his building. A pause. I'll give you my answer tonight, she said. She looked at Stellan last. He held the look, that same quality of reading a thing he hadn't finished reading. She let him read it. Then she went to the door. Lyra? His voice, her name, the first time any of them had used it. She stopped. There's a passage in the oldest of those records, he said, a description of the last Unbound. It says she was found, eventually, not because anyone tracked her scent, but because she kept going back to the place she was most comfortable, the place that felt like home. A pause. Don't go back to the inn. She left anyway. She was halfway back, moving fast through the noon crowd, when she turned the corner of the market road and found Morden's men already there. 6 of them, in plain clothes, positioned at the intervals of people who had been briefed on a specific target, blocking the way to the inn, blocking the way to the bridge, covering the alley mouth she had used that morning. She had 1 second to take in the configuration, and in that second she understood 2 things simultaneously. The first was that Stellan Vark had told her not to go back because he'd known this was coming, and had told her without telling her, and she hadn't listened. The second was that in the middle of those 6 men, standing at the inn's front entrance with his hands folded in front of him, and the expression of a man who had waited patiently for something he had already decided was his, was a figure she had never seen before but recognized instantly from the way the air changed around him, the way even the crowd noise dampened in his immediate vicinity, the way the 6 men reoriented toward him without looking at him, the way power settled over a place like weather. Morden of the Deep West looked up and found her across the crowd, and his mouth moved into something that was not quite a smile. He didn't call out. He didn't gesture. He simply looked at her with the particular patience of a man who had never once in his life not gotten what he came for, and waited. She had 3 exits she could see, and one she could make if she moved before they closed the angle. She had no one behind her she trusted. She had no allies in range and no plan that extended further than the next 30 seconds. She had one thing, the same thing she had always had. She was the blank space. And the blank space, right now, was the only leverage in a city that had decided she was worth fighting over. She looked at Morden across the crowd. Then she moved. She moved left, not toward any of the exits she had mapped. That was the point. Morden's men had mapped those too, had positioned themselves exactly at the angles that made left the wrong choice geometrically. And that was precisely why she took it. Wrong choices that no one had covered were still choices. She went through the gap between the grain merchant's cart and the wall of the dry goods store, tight enough that she had to turn sideways and drag her shoulder along the stone, and came out into the half alley that wasn't on any map she had seen because it wasn't technically an alley. It was the space between 2 buildings that had been constructed at different times by people who hadn't consulted each other, and it ran about 40 feet before opening into the back courtyard of a cooperative she had delivered goods to 6 times in the past year. She heard the shout behind her as she cleared the gap. One of Morden's men, not Morden himself. Morden had not moved from the inn's entrance, she was certain of it, because men like Morden did not chase. They redirected. The cooperative yard was full of barrels in various states of construction and a dog that knew her smell, which was, for once, not a problem, because she had no smell, and the dog watched her pass with the confused attention of an animal whose instincts had just failed to fire. She crossed the yard, went through the far gate, and hit the street running. 3 blocks north. 1 block east. The chandler's shop, the owner of which owed her a debt she had never collected because she had never needed it until right now. She went in through the front, past the hanging candles and the smell of rendered wax, and found Torben at the back counter with his ledger. "I need the storeroom," she said. 20 minutes. He looked at her face. He closed the ledger. 20 minutes, he said. The storeroom was cold and dark and smelled overwhelmingly of tallow, and she sat on a crate of unfinished pillar candles and let her brain run through what she had. Morden had moved faster than Stellan had suggested he would. Either Stellan's information about Morden's timeline was wrong, or Morden had accelerated after the conversation this morning, or, and this was the angle she kept coming back to and not liking, someone in that room had told Morden she was walking back to the inn alone. She sat with that. The Foothills King had pushed too hard for her to accept immediately. The Ironwood man had said very little. Ashaven had made an offer that was structured to sound clean, and clean offers from powerful people were the ones that had always cost her most. And Stellan had warned her not to go back to the inn in a way that she had interpreted as genuine. She had interpreted it as genuine because she had wanted to. That was the thing about surviving alone for a long time. You got good at reading rooms, and you got bad at accounting for the moments when you wanted to believe something, because those moments were infrequent enough that you stopped guarding against them. She stayed in the storeroom for 15 minutes. Then she did the thing that went against everything her instincts said, which was to go back to the meeting, not to the magistrate's hall. That would be watched now. But Stellan had arrived there from somewhere. He had travel clothes when she'd seen him in the courtyard, which meant he'd come from outside the hall, which meant his actual rooms were elsewhere. The Grey March delegation was housed at the Coppergate, the smaller inn on the western edge of the old city, and she knew this because she knew where all 6 delegations were housed, because she had looked at the assignment sheet when she helped Gareth organize it 3 weeks ago. She went to the Coppergate through the riverside lanes, which added 10 minutes but kept her off the main roads. The Grey March guards outside the inn's upper floor were good, better than the inn's layout suggested it needed, positioned to cover the stairwell and the window access both. She did not attempt the front. She went to the kitchen entrance and told the cook she had a delivery message for the Grey March steward, which was believable because she looked like someone who delivered things, which she had always been. The cook sent a boy. The boy came back with a message that said, in 3 words in a tight, angular hand, "Door at end." The room at the end of the upper corridor was smaller than she expected for a king's accommodation. A working room, maps on the table, chairs that weren't ceremonial. Stellan was standing at the window. The Foothills King was not there, and neither was the Ironwood man. Asha Ven sat in the chair nearest the door. Lyra walked in and looked at both of them and said, "Who told Morden?" A beat. "Where is he?" Stellan said. "At the inn. He was waiting. 6 men positioned, him at the door." She watched their faces. Positioned correctly. He knew where I'd be going, and he knew which angles to cover, and the only people who knew I was going back to the inn were in that room. Asha's expression did not move, which told Lyra nothing about guilt and everything about the kind of control you developed when you had run a kingdom as a woman for 30 years. Stellan's expression moved. Barely. A tightening at the jaw that was anger, and anger could be genuine or performed, and she could not currently tell which. "Calder's man," Stellan said, "the Ironwood representative." "You're certain?" "No." He said it without hedging. "But he's the only one in that room with direct reason to keep Morden informed. Calder's been trying to broker a trade agreement with the Deep West for 2 years. Morden has something he wants. That's leverage." He came away from the window. "Did Morden see you?" "Yes." "Did he pursue?" "Not personally." "Then he's going to wait," Asha said from the chair. Her voice was measured in the way of someone who had already worked through the calculation. "That's Morden's method. He makes you feel cornered. He controls the perimeter and waits for you to run into one of his edges. He has patience like other men have weapons." "I'm not running into his edges," Lyra said. "I'm standing in a king's room in a city where I have no standing, no allies I can verify, and no information about what any of you actually plan to do with me when this stops being a tactical problem and starts being a political one." She looked at Stellan directly. "So now would be the time. What do you actually want?" The room was quiet. Asha spoke. "The gathering's full session is tomorrow. All 6 kings, the full Elder Council, every alpha representative from every significant pack in the 6 territories. It happens once a century. Whatever gets said in that room shapes the next 100 years. I know what the gathering is." "Then you know that if Vareth stands up in that room tomorrow and declares the unbound bloodline a biological threat to pack hierarchy, it carries the weight of a formal king's motion. And if Morden seconds it, which he will, because Morden will find it more useful to have you officially classified as a threat than to have you unofficially in his possession, given that your existence is already becoming known, then the council is obligated to act on it. Within the gathering's authority, they can sanction a containment order, neutral city or not." Lyra looked at her. "You're telling me I have until tomorrow?" "I'm telling you the window is not tonight. The window is the session itself." The implication settled. She worked it out and didn't say it aloud and watched Asha's face to see if she was going to say it. Asha said it. "You need to be in that room. I'm laundry staff." "You are the last unbound," Asha said, and the flatness with which she said it was not cruelty. It was the tone of a person who had decided that the clearest thing you could do for someone was say the true thing without softening it. "Vareth can propose your containment tomorrow. Morden can second it. But a king's motion at gathering can also be challenged by the subject of the motion if the subject is present and of age and can demonstrate standing." "What standing do I have?" "Bloodline," Asha said. "If the records are correct, the unbound bloodline predates the current monarchy system. That predates Vareth's claim, Morden's claim, every king's claim in that room. Standing by prior lineage is an ancient law that hasn't been invoked in 800 years, but it has never been formally repealed because the people who built the current system were arrogant enough to believe it would never be needed." Lyra sat down, not because she needed to, because the information had a weight that moved through her and made standing feel like a performance she didn't have energy for. 800 years. The unbound, gone for 800 years, and she had spent 22 of those years believing she was a mistake in the biology of a world that had been built carefully and deliberately, and with her specific erasure as one of its features. "You've known this," she said. "The records. You've known what I might be." "I suspected," Asha said. "When I heard about the gathering's anomaly last night, I suspected. I had the records pulled at dawn. And you came to find me." "Yes." "Before Morden." "Yes." "So the difference between you and Morden," Lyra said, is that you want me in that room making a claim that benefits your political position rather than in a cell making no claims at all. The silence that followed was not a denial. Yes, Asha said finally. That is one true way of saying it. The other true way is that putting you in that room is also the only option that ends with you having any authority over your own fate. Both things are true. I'm not going to pretend I have no stake in this. I have a significant stake in this. The South Reach has been operating under an alpha hierarchy that was never questioned because no one with the standing to question it has been alive for 800 years. A pause. I have been waiting for those records to matter for a long time. Lyra looked at her hands. She had spent her whole life reading people for the angle, for the thing they wanted that they weren't saying directly, and she was reading Asha now with everything she had. The woman was using her. That was clear. The woman also believed what she was saying. Those two things were not contradictions. They were the territory of every powerful person she had ever encountered. The question was never whether someone was using you. The question was whether what they wanted aligned closely enough with what you needed that you could both move in the same direction long enough to matter. I need the records, she said. All of them, tonight. Asha looked at Stellan. Stellan nodded once. I also need to know the layout of the session hall, Lyra said. Entrances, exits, where the kings sit, where the Elder Council sits, the protocols for floor challenge. I need to know exactly which ancient law I'm invoking, and I need to know it cold, because if I stand up in that room and hesitate, Vareth will cut me off before I finish the sentence. I can get you the layout, Stellan said. And I need to know who the Ironwood man reported to tonight, she said. Calder himself, or just the man's own judgment. Why? Because if Calder doesn't know his man leaked, then Calder is still undecided, which means Calder is still reachable. She looked up. You said he was the one you needed and hadn't gotten. If I'm going to walk into that room tomorrow and invoke an 800-year-old law in front of 6 kings who have spent the last 24 hours deciding what to do with me, I would prefer not to do it as a 3-to-3 split. Stellan looked at her with that expression again, the equation, acquiring variables. You're not just surviving this, he said. I've never just survived anything, she said. I've just been doing it somewhere nobody thought to look. She stayed in the Coppergate for 3 hours, working through the records that Asha's assistant brought in 2 leather document cases. The text was old enough that the language required translation, and she worked through it with Asha beside her and Stellan across the table, and the chandler's candles they'd brought burned down to stubs. And outside the window, Ashford Ridge went dark and full of the particular noise of a city that was hosting something larger than itself. The records were worse than she had expected. Not worse as in incorrect, worse as in the clarity with which they laid out what had been done. The Unbound had not simply disappeared. The mate bond system, in its formalized structure, had been deliberately designed to produce no more of them. A biological encoding, an instinctual hierarchy built to self-perpetuate across generations. The records called it stabilization. What it was elimination by architecture, slow and thorough and patient over centuries until the last Unbound bloodline ran out of people to carry it forward. Except it hadn't. She set the page down. They didn't get all of them, she said. No, Asha said. They didn't. She thought about her mother, whom she had never known well enough to ask the right questions of. She thought about the elder who had sniffed the air near her at 6 years old and frowned. She thought about every dismissal, every cruelty, every accommodation she had made for a world that kept telling her she was less than what it required. She had not been less. She had been the proof that the system had a flaw, and the system had taught her to call herself the flaw instead, because that was far more convenient for everyone else. The anger that moved through her then was not hot. It was cold, and it was specific, and it settled into her chest with the weight of something that had found, finally, the shape of the container that fit it. She picked the records back up. She kept reading. It was past midnight when the knock came at the door. 3 knocks, pause, 1, which was the signal Stellan had set with his exterior guard. He went to the door and opened it, and the guard outside said something low and fast, and Stellan's posture changed in a way that changed the room. What? Lyra said. He turned. Marat, the Foothills King. A pause. He went to Vareth an hour ago. The Northern Reach guard saw him go in. He was inside for 40 minutes. The room was silent. He was in this room, Lyra said. Yes. He heard everything we discussed. He knows about the records. He knows about the floor challenge. He knows I'm planning to be at the session tomorrow. Yes. She looked at Asha. Asha's face had gone very still. Not the stillness of control, but the stillness of someone absorbing a blow and deciding whether to show it. The Foothills King, who had burned with urgency, who had pushed for her to leave the city tonight, who had been exactly the right kind of convincing without being the right kind of careful. Not Calder's man, not Morden's leak. Someone who had looked young and overwhelmed and who had decided, somewhere between that meeting and an hour ago, that aligning with Verith was better odds than aligning with an 800-year-old piece of ancient law and the woman who had no scent. He told Verith about the floor challenge, Lyra said. Her voice was level. The anger in her chest burned cold and steady. So tomorrow, when I stand up in that session, Verith will have prepared a counter. He'll have legal argument ready. He'll have motioned to have the ancient standing law addressed before the session opens, or he'll have something worse. Yes, Stellan said, which means walking in with the plan we had is the same as walking in with no plan. Yes. She stood up. She walked to the window and looked at the city below, at the dark streets and the lit windows and the flags of 6 kingdoms hanging still in the cold air. She had spent her life disappearing into the gap between the powerful and the powerless. She had been the blank space, the nothing to smell, the one the system forgot to account for because the system had decided she was beneath accounting for. She had survived on that, had built her entire existence on the architecture of being overlooked. Verith knew she was coming. Morden had her exit routes mapped. Calder was compromised. The plan was burned. The session was in 8 hours. She had nothing left to hide behind. For the first time in 22 years, she stood at a window in a city full of kings and understood with absolute clarity that the only move left was the one that terrified her most. Not to disappear into the gap, but to walk into the center of the room and be exactly and completely what the system had spent 800 years trying to erase. She turned from the window. "Get me into that hall," she said. Not through the delegate's entrance, not hidden in a delegation, through the main doors in plain sight at the moment the session opens. She looked at Stellan, then Asha, and her voice had the cold weight of the thing that had settled in her chest. "If they know I'm coming, then I'm coming. And if Verith has a counter ready, I want to see his face when he realizes that the counter doesn't matter anymore because I'm already standing in front of everyone who needs to hear this." Asha was very quiet for a moment. "That's not a floor challenge," she said. "No," Lyra said. "It's something older than that. They went over the plan 4 times before dawn. Not because it was complicated, because complicated plans required trust in multiple variables, and she was done trusting variables she couldn't control. What they had was simple and brutal and depended almost entirely on timing, which was the one thing she had always been able to manage alone. Stellan would get her to the hall's main entrance before the session opened. Asha would be inside already, in her seat, positioned to second a floor, challenged the moment Lyra opened her mouth. The ancient standing law was 3 sentences long in the original text. She had memorized it in the original language and in translation both, because if she was going to invoke something 800 years old in front of 6 kings and a full elder council, she was going to do it without a paper in her hand. What she could not account for was Verith's counter, or Morden's positioning, or the fact that the Foothills King had spent 40 minutes with the Northern Reach delegation, and she did not know what those 40 minutes had produced. She had stopped trying to account for it at some point around 3 in the morning. There were moves she could not see coming, and there was nothing she could do about that except be present enough and fast enough when they arrived to respond to them before they resolved against her. She had been doing exactly that for 22 years. It was not a comfortable way to live. It was the way she had. Stellan found her in the corridor outside the map room at first light, standing at the window that faced east over the old city's rooftops, watching the sky go from black to iron gray. He came and stood beside her without saying anything, which was the quality she had found most useful about him over the past 12 hours. He knew when silence was the better choice, and he made it without requiring acknowledgement. After a while, he said, "You should eat something." "I'm not hungry." That's not what I said. She went and ate something, cold bread and hard cheese and water that tasted of the iron pipe, and she ate it mechanically because he was right, and she was not going to walk into that hall with her hands shaking from low blood. At 6 in the morning, she looked at herself in the small metal mirror in the room Asha's people had given her for the night. She had no ceremonial clothes. She had what she had arrived in: the plain dark wool, the practical boots, the worn belt. She had a bruise forming on her right shoulder from the tannery wall. She had shadows under her eyes from the hours spent reading records by candle stub. She looked exactly like what she was: a wolf who had spent her whole life in the margins of a world that had not wanted her, who was about to walk into the room where that world made its decisions and tell it something it had been trying not to hear for 8 centuries. She straightened her collar. She went to find Stellan. The council hall was the oldest building in Ashford Ridge, built in a time when the 6 territories were still finding their edges, and a neutral meeting ground was a survival necessity rather than a political convenience. The stone was darker than the surrounding city, the door frames thick enough that 2 people could stand in them side by side. The main hall capable of holding 300 wolves, with the high ceiling vaulted above them in a way that trapped every sound and sent it back amplified. Lyra knew this because Stellan had described it with the precision of a man who had studied the space before deciding to use it. He walked beside her on the approach, 2 blocks through the early morning streets, and neither of them spoke. Behind them, at a distance she did not check because checking would make her slow down, 2 of Asha's guards maintained a pace that was visible enough to be a statement and close enough to be functional. The hall's main entrance was flanked by Elder Council staff, and beyond them, delegates filing in through the wide doors. The session was not for another 20 minutes. The delegates were early because powerful people were always early to rooms where power was being distributed. It was one of the consistent things she had observed about them, the way they positioned themselves before the formal event began, the way the room's hierarchy was actually established in the minutes before any official proceeding. She saw Vareth's delegation from across the street. The Northern Reach King was at the center of a cluster of 8, moving toward the entrance with the unhurried weight of a man who believed the room was already his before he entered it. He was larger than she had registered from the square, not just tall but dense, built the way old trees were built, with mass that went all the way through. His expression was flat and organized. His eyes went to her across the distance before any of his people noticed her, and she understood immediately that he had been watching for her approach, that his people had his sight lines mapped, and that at least 2 of the cluster were not courtiers but guards in courtier clothes. He did not stop. He did not alter course. He looked at her for precisely 2 seconds, long enough to communicate that he had seen her and was not alarmed by her presence. And then he looked away and continued toward the entrance. That was a specific message. She received it. He was not alarmed because he had the counter ready. Stellan put his hand briefly on her arm, not restraining, directional. They moved toward the entrance from the south angle, which brought them to the doors at the moment the Elder Council staff was managing a knot of delegates from the Eastern Coast territories. And in the brief confusion of bodies and precedents, she went through the door with the Eastern Coast delegation around her, and no one stopped her because she looked like someone who knew where she was going and moved like someone who had been told she was expected. Inside, the hall was already half filled, and the noise was the particular noise of 200 wolves in a formal space. Lowered voices that still carried the shift of formal dress, the barely audible undertone of a dozen different pack markings interacting in a confined space. She felt the room register her in pieces as she moved toward the floor's center section, not because she was notable to look at, but because every wolf in the room's instincts fired and found nothing, and that nothing moved through the crowd like a ripple in water, heads turning without people knowing why they were turning. She found a position in the 3rd row of the floor delegates, between a mid-rank alpha from the Western Coast and an elder's administrative assistant who was too busy with his notes to look up. She stood and watched the room fill. Asha was already seated in the king's tier, positioned at its south end, her back straight, and her expression the one Lyra had come to identify as working stillness, the face she wore when she was running calculations. Their eyes met across the floor. Asha gave her nothing visible, no gesture, no acknowledgement. Good. Acknowledgement would flag her position. Morden came in at 7 minutes before the session. He came through the eastern entrance, which was not the delegates' entrance, but the secondary access used by kings when they wanted to avoid the main door's visibility. He moved to his place in the king's tier without looking at the floor, and Lyra watched him settle and watched the quality of his attention when he scanned the room, and she registered the precise moment he found her. The micro-stillness, the smallest reorganization of his posture. He did not react beyond that. Morden, she was increasingly certain, never reacted beyond that. The Foothills King came in 2 minutes later and took his seat without looking at her section at all, which was its own kind of look. Then Vareth. He entered from the main doors, which was deliberate. The Northern Reach King, largest delegation, largest army, choosing the entrance with the most visibility because everything Vareth did was a statement about what he already considered settled. He crossed the floor at the unhurried pace she had seen outside, took his position in the king's tier at its north end, and then he did what she had been waiting for. He spoke to the elder sitting nearest to him. Low, brief. The elder's expression did not change, but his hand moved to the document case on his left, which he had not touched before that moment. Stellan slid into position at the king's tier's center, just as the council head, Elder Corvan, stepped to the formal speaking position at the hall's far end. She found Stellan in her peripheral vision and did not look at him directly. Corvan called the session to order in the formal language, the traditional phrases that opened a gathering and had not changed in 300 years. The room settled into the particular weight of formal proceeding. She felt the moment all around her, felt it in the floor under her boots and in the vault above. 200 wolves and 6 kings and 100 years of built pressure looking for the shape it would take for the next century. Corvan had barely finished the opening address when Vareth stood. "Point of order," Vareth said. His voice did not require the hall's acoustics. It filled the space on its own. "Before this session proceeds to its formal agenda, I move that the council address a matter of immediate relevance to the safety and stability of the gathering itself." Corvan's expression was neutral with great effort. "The floor acknowledges the Northern Reach." "There is an individual currently present in this hall," Vareth said, "who represents an anomaly in pack biology that the council has not formally classified or addressed. This individual carries no scent signature. This absence has been confirmed by 5 of the 6 sitting kings." His eyes moved across the floor and found her with the precision of a man who had located her the moment he walked in. "I call for her identification and immediate assessment under gathering security protocol." The room moved. Not loud. A current through the floor delegates, heads turning, the sound of 200 wolves locating the thing they hadn't been able to name since yesterday. She did not look down. She did not look at Stellan. She looked at Vareth, and she held it. Corvan said, "The council will need, I invoke standing by prior lineage." Her voice in the hall's acoustics came back to her from the vault ceiling, and it was steadier than she expected, which was the thing about cold anger. It burned clean, and it did not shake. The room went completely still. "Under the law of original standing," she said, and she kept her voice level and her eyes on Corvan because Corvan was the authority she needed, not Vareth. "A descendant of a bloodline predating the current monarchic system may not be subjected to classification, assessment, or containment without first having the right to address the full gathering and demonstrate their standing. The law has not been repealed. I am invoking it now." Vareth said, "That law has not been applicable for—" "Has it been repealed?" she said. Not loud, precise. The elder with the document case had opened it. He was reading. His face had gone the color of old paper. "Elder Corvan," she said, still not looking at Vareth, "has that law been formally repealed at any gathering in the recorded history of this council?" Corvan looked at the elder with the document case. The elder looked up from his reading and gave Corvan the smallest shake of his head, a silence that rewrote the room's temperature. "No," Corvan said. Vareth's hand on his chair's arm was flat and very still. The stillness of a large, disciplined man absorbing something he had not fully prepared for, despite having had 8 hours. He looked at her across the floor. Not the 2-second dismissal from outside, but a real look, the kind that reassessed. And then he looked at the document case elder, and then he looked at something in the middle distance while he calculated. Morden had not moved. Morden had the expression of a man watching a play he had not written, but was interested to see resolved. The floor recognizes, Corvan started. I object to the basis of the claim, Vareth said. The claimant has not demonstrated bloodline. A verbal invocation of prior lineage is not sufficient under what authority? Asha said from the king's tier. Every head in the room turned to her. Under what written authority, Asha said, is verbal invocation insufficient? Cite the statute, Vareth. Chapter and record. Vareth looked at her with something that was not quite anger and not quite respect, and was possibly both occupying the same space. The tradition of the gathering has always required. Tradition is not statute, Asha said. This gathering runs on written law, or it runs on the biggest army present. Which is it? The hall held that question. She felt it in the room. The 200 wolves on the floor, the alpha representatives from every significant pack in the 6 territories, feeling the question land and understanding what it meant. Not just for her, for them. For every pack that had ever had a king's tradition override a written law and had been told to accept the difference. Vareth sat back down. Not because he had given up, because he was calculating the field position, and right now the field position had moved in a way he needed to account for before he moved again. Corvan said, the floor recognizes the claimant. She walked toward the speaking position. The crowd on the floor opened for her in the particular way that people open for something they can't identify but can feel, some instinctive clearing of space for an unknown quantity. She walked through it, and she did not hurry, and she did not slow. And in the 20 seconds it took her to cross the floor, she understood something she had not fully understood until this moment. She had always believed that being without scent meant being without presence. Had believed that what she couldn't offer biologically, she couldn't offer at all, that the mate bond silence around her meant she was simply less here, less real, less worth the air she moved through. What she understood now was that she had been reading it wrong her whole life. The blank space was not absence. It was the one frequency in a room full of noise that cut through everything because it was the only thing that didn't fit the pattern. And the pattern was all they knew how to listen for. She was the loudest thing in the building. She had always been the loudest thing in every building. She had simply been told it was silence. She reached the speaking position. She turned to face the hall. 6 kings, 200 wolves, the elder council in their gray coats, all of them looking at the woman who had no scent, the woman who had cleaned rooms and hung laundry and spent 22 years making herself small enough to survive a world that had been built with her erasure as a specification. She opened her mouth. The eastern entrance doors came off their hinges. Not the lock, the hinges. All 3 of them, simultaneously, from the outside, in a single impact that sent the heavy oak panels inward across the stone floor with a sound like the hall had been struck. Dust from the ancient doorframe dropped in a sheet. The crowd noise went from the hush of formal session to raw animal sound. 200 wolves in a confined space reacting to something that triggered every threat response simultaneously. Morden's men came through first, 8 of them in the deep gray of Deep West soldiers, moving in a spread formation that was not a charge but a deployment. Behind them came 4 more, and behind those 4, a figure she hadn't expected. The Foothills King, walking with Morden's men, not as a captive. She had 3 seconds to understand the shape of it before Vareth's guards moved into position along the northern wall, not toward Morden, not toward her, but into the configuration of a force that was waiting to see which way it needed to go. Morden walked into the hall through the ruin of the eastern doors, stepped over the fallen panel without looking at it, and crossed to the center of the floor where she stood. He stopped 12 feet from her. He was not what she had pictured. Medium height, lean, unremarkable at a glance, the kind of face that told you nothing by design. He wore no formal dress. He looked like a man who had decided that showing up in plain clothes to the most significant formal session in a century was itself the statement he wanted to make. He looked at her with the specific calm of someone who had been patient for a long time and had decided the patience was finished. "I think," he said, his voice conversational in the stunned silence of the hall, "we've let this go on long enough." She looked at him, at his men, at Vareth's forces along the wall, not moving, waiting, at the floor full of alphas from every territory who were calculating whether to run or hold, at Asha standing at the king's tier with her guards already at her side. at Stellan on his feet, at the speaking position she was standing in, which was the only place in this hall where she had any authority and from which she had not said a single word yet. She had no weapon, she had no guard, she had no pack, no banner, no army along any wall. She had the record she had memorized last night, and the law she had invoked, and the hall full of wolves who were watching to see what she was. And she had the thing she had always had, the thing that had kept her alive through every version of this. The cold, clear understanding that the only move left when there was nothing left to lose was the one that changed the shape of everything around it. She turned back to the hall. To the 200 wolves who had not moved, who were still watching, who were still listening. And she said, "Let me tell you what was done to you." The hall did not go quiet. It went still, which was a different thing. Quiet was the absence of sound. What happened in that hall when she spoke those 6 words was the cessation of movement. 200 wolves and 6 kings and a floor full of alpha representatives from every corner of the known world, all of them stopping at the same instant, in the way that a herd stops when something in the environment shifts below the threshold of conscious recognition. The body understood before the mind did. The body had always understood. That was what they had used against it. She did not look at Morden. She did not look at Vareth's guards along the northern wall. She looked at the floor of the hall, at the faces turned toward her, and she spoke the way she had learned to speak through 22 years of being the person in the room nobody looked at. Directly, without theater, the way you talk to people when you needed them to actually hear the words. 800 years ago, she said, someone built a system. They called it instinct. They built it into your blood and your bones and the part of you that fires before you choose, and they built it so deep and so early that you stopped asking whether it was always there, whether it was yours, whether you chose it. She paused. Not for effect, because the next part mattered and she needed it clean. You didn't. None of you did. It was designed, encoded, and the people who designed it removed every bloodline that existed before it, every wolf who carried the memory that the bond was a construction and not a law of nature, every one of them, over generations, until there were none left who could tell you what I'm telling you now. The hall breathed. Morden said, "Take her." Nobody moved. It was not defiance, not yet, not consciously. It was the lag between a command and the bodies that were supposed to carry it out. And in that lag was something she recognized as the only window she was going to get. She kept talking. The mate bond tells you who your alpha is, who your king is, who owns your obedience and your territory and your future. It fires in your blood like fact, like gravity, like something that was always true. She let her eyes move across the floor, from face to face, the mid-rank alphas and the pack representatives and the administrative elders in their gray coats, all of them carrying the weight of something they had never examined because examining it had never been an option. But gravity doesn't need enforcers. Truth doesn't need armies. The bond needs Vareth's guard along that wall and Morden's men through that door, and 800 years of erasing every bloodline that remembered it was built by someone, which means it was built for someone, and that someone was not you. Vareth said, "This is sedition." "It's a history lesson," she said. "You can call it sedition if that's more comfortable." A sound moved through the floor, not laughter, not agreement, something that lived between them. The sound of a room recalibrating. She felt it in her sternum. Morden moved. He did not give a second command. He crossed the floor toward her himself, the 12 feet between them covered in the unhurried stride of a man who had decided that the way to stop a fire was to step on it directly. And his 4 closest guards moved with him in the configuration of people who had done this specific action together before. Stellan came off the king's tier. She had not coordinated this with him. There had been no signal. He moved the way a person moves when the calculation resolves before the conscious decision catches up, crossing from the tier to the floor in 2 steps and placing himself between her and Morden with the particular physical language of a man who had decided something about where he was standing and was not interested in discussing it. "Stellan." Morden stopped. His voice was still conversational. "You're in my way." "I'm aware," Stellan said. "Move." "No." The word landed flat and certain, and in the silence after it she heard the sound of other movement. Asha's guards repositioning at the south end of the tier, a shift of bodies in the floor crowd, two of the Eastern Reach Alpha representatives stepping closer to her position in a way that was not organized but was deliberate. Morden looked at the room. At the hall full of wolves who had just heard 6 words and a history and were now standing at the edge of a choice they had never been given the vocabulary for before this moment. He looked at her over Stellan's shoulder. His face still held that patient calm, but underneath it, for the first time, she could see the edge of what patience was built on top of. Not certainty, but the performance of it, worn so long it had almost become the real thing. Almost. "You have no power here," he said to her. "You have words. Words don't stop armies." "No," she said, "but they stop soldiers." She looked past him at the 8 men who had come through the eastern doors, then at Vareth's guards along the northern wall, then at the floor full of pack representatives who had come from every territory in the 6 kingdoms and who were going to go home and tell their packs what had happened in this hall, regardless of how the next 10 minutes resolved, because that was what people did with information that changed the shape of what they thought was true. "Every wolf in this hall right now," she said, not raising her voice, trusting the acoustics, "goes home to a pack. To people who follow them because the bond says to follow and because the kings enforce what the bond says. They go home tonight, and what they tell their packs about what happened in this room, that is not something Morden can contain. That is not something Vareth's army can prevent. The words are already out. They were out the moment I spoke them." She let that sit. "You can take me. You can put me wherever you put things you want the world to forget. But the question I put in this room today does not leave with me. It stays. And every wolf who heard it takes it home in their chest and lies awake with it. And eventually they ask it out loud, and eventually someone answers." Morden's jaw was still. His eyes were doing the things she had seen powerful men's eyes do when they were recalculating, moving through the variables fast, not panicking, looking for the angle that still worked. There was no angle. She could see it from where she stood. Not because she was exceptional at reading him specifically, but because she had spent 22 years reading rooms that didn't want to be read, and she knew what it looked like when the architecture ran out. Vareth stood from his seat in the king's tier. Every head turned. He was large enough that standing was itself a statement, and he made it without words for a long moment, looking at the floor full of representatives from the packs that existed under his authority, and beside his authority, and in some cases in spite of his authority. He looked at Morden. He looked at the Foothills King, who had gone very still in his seat and had the expression of a young man experiencing, possibly for the first time, the specific consequence of betting on the wrong resolution. Then Vareth looked at Lyra. "The records," he said, "the ones you read last night, where are they?" "Ashaven has copies," she said. "I have the text memorized. The Elder Council has the originals in their archive, filed under a classification that hasn't been accessed in 2 generations, because the people who filed them assumed no one would ever have reason to look." She held his gaze. "They were wrong." A long silence. "If what you're saying is accurate," Vareth said, and the deliberateness with which he chose that phrasing told her something significant about him. He was not a man who conceded, but he was a man who was capable of adjusting. "Then the implications extend beyond this gathering." "Yes," she said, "beyond this generation." "Yes. You understand that what you're describing—" He stopped, started again. "If the bond's hierarchy was artificially constructed, then the legitimate authority of every pack structure that exists under it is built on a foundation that needs to be examined," she said. "Not necessarily dismantled. Examined, honestly, which is different." She let her eyes move briefly to the floor. "Not every pack structure is wrong because the bond was constructed. Pack is real. Loyalty is real. The choice to protect something and be protected by it is real. What was wrong was taking that choice away, making the bond compulsory, building it into the blood so that obedience felt like instinct and resistance felt like illness." She brought her eyes back to him. "Your authority over packs that chose you is not invalidated by what I'm telling you. Your authority over packs that had no choice. That's the part that needs looking at." Vareth sat back down. He did not agree. She did not expect him to agree. Not today, not in this hall, not in front of this room full of wolves who were watching everything he did. But he sat, which was a different thing from moving against her, and different was sufficient for right now. Morden looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at the hall. Then he looked at his men who were standing in the positions they had entered in and had not advanced further, and she understood that they hadn't advanced because the crowd on the floor had thickened in the space between them and her, not in a wall, but in the organic way that people fill space when they've decided where they're standing without having a meeting about it. He looked at her one final time with the eyes of a man who was not finished, who was not the kind of person who was ever finished, but who had accurately assessed that the specific action he had entered this hall to take was no longer executable in the current conditions. "This isn't over," he said. "I know," she said, "but this part is." He walked out. His men went with him. The Foothills King did not follow. He stayed in his seat looking at the floor in front of him with the expression of someone who would be doing a significant amount of thinking for the foreseeable future. The hall let out its breath. Elder Corvan, who had not spoken since the doors came off their hinges, who had stood at the formal speaking position through the entire exchange with the expression of a man living through a historical event he had not prepared for and was professionally obligated to manage, said, "The session will recess for 2 hours. The council will convene in private. All relevant records are requested to be provided to the council's review." He looked at Lyra when he said relevant records, and she nodded, and that was enough. The room began to break apart. Not the chaos of retreat, the particular noise of a large group of people who have been handed a significant piece of information and are now processing it in the ways that humans processed significant information, in small clusters, in low urgent voices, in the body language of people who needed to talk to the people they came with. Stellan came to stand beside her. He did not say anything for a moment. They stood together in the slowly emptying floor of the hall, and the morning light came through the high, narrow windows in bars across the stone, and somewhere outside the building the city of Ashford Ridge was going about its ordinary morning without knowing that the room they were standing in had just bent the shape of the next century. "You didn't need the law," he said finally. "I needed it to get the floor." After that, she thought about that. After that, I needed them to listen. They listened, he said. She looked at the empty speaking position she had walked away from. Some of them. Enough of them. A pause. Vareth will take 6 months. Morden will take longer. Calder will read the records and make a decision, and the decision will be careful and correct and take 2 years. He was quiet for a moment. But the pack representatives in this room today go home tonight, to wolves who have never had this question. And they won't know what to do with it, she said. Not immediately, he said, but you didn't need them to know what to do. You needed them to have it. The question lives on its own once it's in someone. She understood that. She had been the question living on its own for 22 years. The weeks that followed were not clean. She had not expected them to be. Clean resolutions were for histories written after enough time had passed to smooth the edges, and she was living in the middle of it where the edges were still raw and the shape of things had not settled. The Elder Council's review of the records took 3 weeks and produced a document that was careful and qualified and stopped significantly short of a declaration, but was also not a denial, which was the most anyone had reasonably hoped for in 3 weeks. Vareth's delegation went home without further incident and without further hostility, which was different from peace but was closer to it than she had expected from a man his size with an army that large. Calder of Ironwood requested copies of everything and took them with him. Morden went south and east, and she heard nothing from him for 2 months, and then heard from Asha that he was engaged in a territorial dispute that had nothing to do with her, which either meant he had genuinely moved on or meant he was very good at patience, and she thought probably both. The Foothills King came to find her 3 days after the session. He looked like someone who had not slept well and was not going to apologize for it. "I did what I thought was the better odds," he said. "I know," she said. "I was wrong about the odds." "Yes." He was quiet. He was still young enough that being wrong sat visibly on him, hadn't yet calcified into the kind of wrong that older powerful people carried around inside them where you couldn't see it. "What do I owe you?" "Nothing," she said. "Go home. Think about the question. When your packs ask you about it, and they will ask you, don't lie to them." He left. She didn't know what he would do with that. She had said the true thing, and that was what she had. Stellan was the last one she spoke to in Ashford Ridge the morning she left. She was in the Chandler's courtyard, which was not rational. It was not on her way anywhere, but it was the place she had come to when she needed to think, and it was the place she wanted to stand one more time before she stopped standing in it. Torben had given her coffee without being asked, which was its own kind of farewell. Stellan found her there without her being surprised by it. "Where?" he said. "I don't know yet," she said. "There are packs in the Southern Territories that the records mention, families who might carry fragments of what the unbound remembered. People who've been told their whole lives they were anomalies." She looked at the coffee in her hands. "Someone should find them before Morden does." "I could send people." "I know you could." She looked at him. "I need to go myself. You understand why?" He understood. She could see it, the way his face held the thing he wanted to say and let it go because it wasn't the right thing for this moment, and he knew it. That quality of knowing when silence was the better choice. She had respected it from the beginning, and she respected it now. "The Grey March will be watching what the council does with the records," he said. "Good," she said. "Keep watching. Make noise when they slow down." "We're good at making noise." "I know." She finished the coffee. She set the cup down. She looked at him one last time in the clear morning light. The king who had warned her when he could have used her, who had stood between her and Morden, not because she was valuable to him strategically, but because something in him had decided and stuck with the decision. She had not let herself think too carefully about what that meant, because thinking carefully about it would have complicated things she needed to keep simple. She let herself think about it now, briefly. She let herself have it for the length of time it took to pick up her pack from the courtyard wall and settle it on her shoulder. "Thank you," she said. "Don't," he said. "You did. You did this. All of it. You held the door." "That's all I did." She shook her head slowly. "That's not all," she said, "but I understand why you need to say it that way." She walked out of the courtyard and into the street and did not look back. Not because looking back was weakness, but because there was nothing behind her that she hadn't already accounted for. The city was awake around her and ordinary in the way that cities were ordinary when the event that had just happened in them hadn't fully landed yet, when the implications were still traveling outward in waves and the surface was still calm. She walked east, toward the gate, toward the road that went south into the territories she had never been to, where people she hadn't met were carrying questions that didn't have names yet, the same way she had carried something without a name for 22 years until she stood in a hall full of kings and found the words for it. The gate guards didn't look at her. She passed through without incident, the way she had always moved through spaces, without signature, without the scent that would have told the wolves around her exactly what she was and where she came from and who she belonged to. Except she knew now what the silence meant. It didn't mean she was hollow. It didn't mean she was broken or anomalous or beneath the notice of a world that tracked identity through smell. It meant she had existed before the system that required that signal. It meant her blood remembered a time when who you were was not encoded by someone else into your body and presented to you as instinct, when the choice of where to stand and who to protect and what to build was actually a choice, not an architecture. She had spent 22 years learning to make herself small enough to survive in the gap between what the world valued and what it didn't. She had not been living in a gap. She had been living in what remained after everything constructed had been stripped away, in the space where something real could exist if you were patient enough and stubborn enough to stay in it long enough to find out what it was. The road south was long, and the morning was cold, and the grass on either side of the packed earth was silver with the last of the season's frost. Her breath came out in slow, visible clouds, and she walked with the particular pace of someone who had distance to cover and wasn't racing it, and above her the sky was the hard, clear blue of early autumn at full light, the kind of sky that showed you everything. She was not going home. She had never had one. She was not going toward a mate, a pack, a bond that had chosen her before she could consent to the choosing. She was not going toward a king's protection or a queen's agenda or a treaty that had her name in it as an asset. She was going toward the people who were waiting for someone to come and tell them the same thing she had needed to hear. that the silence inside them was not absence, that the thing they had been told was a flaw was proof of something older and harder and more fundamental than the system that called it a flaw. That survival was not the highest aspiration. That the question of who you were when nothing was required of you and no bond compelled you and no hierarchy told you where to stand, that question was not a threat to the world. That question was how the world got better. She walked south. The frost burned off the grass in the climbing light. The road opened ahead of her, long and specific and entirely hers, and she followed it the way she had always followed the only direction available to her, forward, without looking back, with the cold burning clarity of a woman who had finally stopped apologizing for taking up space in a world that had forgotten it built its floor on top of her. She had no scent. She had no pack. She had no bond that told her who she was before she could decide for herself. She had everything else. And it was, she understood now, in the specific and ordinary and irreversible way that people understood things that had been true the whole time. Enough. It had always been enough. She had just needed the room to prove it.